Hello, this is Dr. Catherine Demps, and today you are listening to the lecture on the behavioral ecology of market origins. When I was a graduate student, I spent my focus understanding how local ecological knowledge was associated with foraging behavior and how cultural transmission and evolution of that knowledge then affected behavior. Since then, I have become deeply interested in the human behavioral ecology of foraging and how we can apply foraging theory outside of traditional realms. How do ancient evolved decision making mechanisms get used in modern contexts? Evolution tends to be conservative, so how might resource acquisition decisions apply beyond food collection? I've applied this perspective to two venues in the last several years, to outdoor recreation as a foraging for leisure problem, and to the origins of markets. Like any other subsistence decision, participating in market exchange involves balancing costs and benefits in the context of time allocation. Although many people claim that markets didn't exist before the European Industrial Revolution, the ancient world is full of them. In a survey of 30 pre modern states, archaeologists found that 26 feature significant commercialization, and it was minimal, although not entirely absent, from the other four. When Darwin visited some of the Chilean islands during his voyage of the Beagle, he observed, "I have seen a man bringing on his back a bag of charcoal with which to buy some little trifle, and another a plank to exchange for a bottle of wine. Hence, every tradesman must also be a merchant, and again sell the goods which he takes in exchange." European sailors like Darwin regularly relied on local markets around the world before storable provisions were invented. And there is a growing realization that barter and trade are ubiquitous prior to industrialization, even though markets now and in the past can sometimes look quite different from price setting economies. Markets are so widespread that market participation can now be listed as a hallmark of the human species, along with language, culture, and cooperation. Like these other hallmarks, it's really a difference of degree that we isolate ourselves from other species. Chimps and crows use tools, whales and bees communicate, but only humans have such a complexity and dependence on language and culture. Market type forces have also been observed to affect animal behavior, such as the mating markets of baboons and sage grouse leks. Although, again, there is a difference of degree between animal markets and the exchange of commodity, labor, and services that most humans have come to depend upon. And interestingly, while every society has language and culture, not every society participates in market exchange. So it seems that it's not markets themselves that are a hallmark of humanity, but our capacity to participate in them when it makes sense. This is where human behavioral ecology can help us understand the decision making process that individuals and households engage in when determining whether it is worthwhile to participate in market exchange. Unlike economists, who can be puzzled when they find markets missing, evolutionary anthropologists start from the opposite perspective. Humans didn't have markets for most of our history, so what causes households to begin separating production for consumption versus production for exchange? Our first assumption is that our long dependence on interpersonal and interhousehold exchange have pre-adapted us with the cognitive tools of a trader, and that we approach exchange as hominins, adept at balancing self-interest with respect for the conventions that make stable social engagements possible. Nobel Prize winner Elinor Ostrom summarizes the outcome of this evolution from the perspective of institutional economics. Our evolutionary heritage has hardwired us to be boundedly self-seeking at the same time that we are capable of learning heuristics and norms that help achieve Successful collective action that makes voluntary, gainful market exchange stable, like at this vegetable market I visited in South India, or the Dahomey markets documented in West Africa by Herskovits in the early 20th century. Markets have been held responsible for the historical 18th century Great Transformation in Western Europe to a price setting economy, as cited by Polanyi, with not only goods but land, labor, and capital fully commoditized, a development seen by some as the creation of the modern world. Kenneth Hirth, in his 2010 paper, points out that prehistoric markets fostered craft specialization, urbanization, and provided opportunities for elites to consolidate prestige and power, all important elements of developing socio political complexity. Whenever it emerges, market participation influences livelihood strategies, social differentiation, subsistence patterns, and opportunities for economic development, education, and medical aid. But markets have also been linked to the degradation of both human well being and the environment. And yet, we know relatively little about the conditions under which we expect markets to arise and remain stable. Price setting markets in modern economies have been well studied. The origins of human exchange behavior in pre modern conditions have not. Archaeological data is currently hard to come by, although there are a few books out recently that show great interest in the topic. Anthropologists and archaeologists still lack models for predicting market development. So we start with the bottom up decision faced by households. When does it make sense to participate in a market? We can use the cost benefit analysis of behavioral ecology to understand the origins of markets by identifying the conditions that make production for and participation in exchange worthwhile. My premise then is that it only requires the right opportunity, the right combination of structural conditions and ecological and social factors to make market exchange a part of a hominin subsistence portfolio. Let's start by thinking about the benefits to extra community exchange. Households are most likely to avail themselves of exchange opportunities when they can increase the value of commodities they can produce by exchanging them for those that they cannot produce, or which are locally costly to produce. As Solons and Marx slightly misquote, the value of the thing is just as much as it will bring. So when we think of what people gain from exchange, it's whether they can acquire more value by producing something in their household, taking it to market, and trading it for something else. The value of that something else is what they can gain. Close-packed geo-environmental heterogeneity appears to frequently promote this event. As Pizer finds, people may be more disposed to be generous to outgroup strangers when there is minimal access to non-local resources. In highland Mesoamerica, household production in grain, fruit, crafts, pottery, and other goods passed through a thriving system of interregional exchange and resource movement. Nearly 90% of communities in prehistoric Mesoamerica lived within 30 kilometers of a climactic vegetation zone different from their own, a setting of high ecological diversity that stimulated many peasant households and small-scale merchants to engage in trade, offering products from different environmental zones for sale in regional marketplaces as part of their normal domestic routine. I spent a lot of time talking with Dr. David Nolan, who studied the coastal community of La Malera in Indonesia. Folks in this fishing village depend on exchange of marine protein for the inland carbohydrates that they can't produce on their rocky volcanic soils. And the folks inland have difficulty producing enough protein. So this is a great instance of two commodities with a coincidence of needs between villages, a known distance to a marketplace, and an occasion for bartered exchange. And they meet weekly at markets like the one at Wulandoni, where women from the interior bring carbohydrates like dried maize and some other agricultural products like bananas and mangoes, and exchange them for marine products with women from the coastal fishing villages. As far as I've talked with other ethnographic researchers working in areas of climatic variation, either near coasts or along elevation changes, This type of interregional exchange seems to be ubiquitous. In some instances, sociopolitical complexity and a division of labor can produce this coincidence of need as well. Among the West African Dahomey in the early 20th century, weavers, jewelers, stool makers, and carvers were a few of the craft guilds that produced for local markets, dependent on plying their specialized skill set in return for others' agricultural surplus. In this way, people gain value from their labor, trading that which it is easy for them to produce for that which they can't or which is difficult for them to produce, thereby gaining value overall. Increases in population density also increase the potential benefits to participating in market exchange and decrease the potential costs. A concentration of population, local and regional, implies lower odds of failing to find a trade partner once at a marketplace and elevates the odds of advantageously exchanging quantities of goods. Greater population density increases the diversity of productive skills and aptitudes expressed in the population participating in the market, and even ephemeral increases in population density, such as ritual events, create incentives to participate in market exchange. Corresponding increases in socio-political complexity could lead to increased infrastructure like road construction and standardized weights and measures, as revenues from markets are used to decrease transaction costs and encourage greater participation. Valley-dwelling, middle sedentary Hohokam villages in the North American Southwest engaged in lively barter markets in which upland game, wild plant foods, and raw stone materials for tool making flowed opposite lowland agricultural goods such as corn and cotton. Archaeologists have long speculated that because Hohokam ball games drew large crowds, the events were also ideal venues for the exchange of goods. Several circumstances collectively clarify how the Hohokam typify nascent marketing systems, with 1. A diverse ecological landscape in which resources were disproportionately distributed and led to reliable dependencies among populations. 2. A widely accepted religious beliefs which promoted cooperation, consensus, social stability, and the peace of the marketplace. 3. Large-scale irrigation infrastructure capable of surplus agricultural production. And 4. A benign environmental regime that fostered the geographically expansive and horizontally integrated religious and economic network across which commodities and information freely flowed. We can capture the potential cost of participating in exchange into 3 categories: travel costs, transaction costs, and opportunity costs, which I outline here in a formal theoretical model based on central place foraging theory and the marginal value theorem. Exchange opportunities contribute to creating the value curve that you see in blue. As people input effort into production along the x-axis where it says production costs, we see a corresponding rise in value. But this value is not due to the products that have been produced in the household, but it's the value of exchange that people can get after they've traded those products. So again, the value of the thing is just as much as it will bring. Here is the exchange value per production costs. You can see that after a certain amount of production costs, the bold line of the exchange value curve is higher than the thin line of the consumption curve. So beyond a certain point, it makes more sense to exchange goods that have been produced instead of consuming them for use in the household. I'd be happy to talk to you further about the fine details of the model, but really it's good to understand how we can use its guidelines to understand exchange decisions. For example, let's think about travel costs. On the x-axis to the left of the value y-axis, we see a mark called TM with a red dashed line. Beyond this travel cost, either in distance or time, people are not getting a worthwhile amount of value from exchange for how difficult it is to get to market. So we can use simple rules like if the market is too far or too difficult to get to, we don't expect people to participate in exchange. Travel costs can include time, energy, money, or risks of predation by other humans and animals. And it's a fairly straightforward matter that the greater the travel cost, the lower the likelihood that exchange will be gainful. Similarly, the higher the travel cost independent of distance, maybe because you're carrying something very heavy, or the terrain is difficult, or it's a really dangerous road, the lower your likelihood of going to market. We can capture potential costs to participating in exchange into three categories. Because it helps us conceive of how people are making decisions, even though sometimes you can lump them into similar categories in other examples. So let's talk about travel costs first. There's been a growing interest in market integration and how things like new roads to previously unconnected communities like those of the Maya or in the Nepalese Himalayas lead to people not only participating in markets more often as buying things, but producing for market participation to gain cash money or to do barter-based exchange of agricultural products with other communities. Now that travel costs have been decreased, a road significantly decreases travel costs, makes it easier to get to the market or easier for the market to come to you. Transaction costs are the cost of doing business. This is the time spent finding a partner at a market and completing an exchange. This can be loss of value through paying a market tax or losing some of your goods due to spoilage or not being able to sell everything. Transaction costs can also include theft or loss of saleable goods through coercion from exchange partners. If any or all of these are large enough, they can devalue the gains from exchange enough to discourage participation. Because participating in a market only makes sense when it's going to increase the value you get from how you spend your time. And if the value is not enough to compete with other activities like producing for consumption within the household, people will spend their time in better ways. A variety of social and institutional factors can mitigate transaction costs and do appear to be associated with early exchange behavior. For the Hohokam example, Abbott describes how the ball games, regulated by custom and propriety, constituted a mantle under which lively bargaining for utilitarian commodities could take place, even among parties who had no prior social relationship with one another. Like these, the local intercommunity markets and fairs of early medieval England and Scandinavia were often associated with churchyards, where the regular assembly of large groups offered opportunities for orderly Sunday trade. The churchyard setting also presumably sanctioned orderliness to the proceedings, lowering transaction costs with norms aimed to balance self-interest and social regard for market cooperation. In fact, some historians claim that markets in England were retarded for centuries due to the lack of institutions to reduce transaction costs. So, lack of standardized weights and measures, and also low population density that made it hard to find exchange partners. One of the things that should be talked about with markets is money, and I won't go deeply into it here, but I think it's important to mention. A lot of times we see money associated with markets, but not always. It's difficult to always know which comes first, markets or money. But we do see money playing an important function for decreasing transaction costs in markets, even though there are many markets today among which bartered exchange, that is, commodity for commodity exchange, still exists and still functions smoothly. In a lot of early markets, we see items functioning as commodities and as money, and we call these dual functioning commodities, commodity money. These are material items that can be consumed or held for their exchange value. And they can decrease transaction costs by increasing the ability to complete indirect exchanges, where a direct coincidence of needs does not exist, thereby reducing search costs to find exchange partners. So I have ceramic bowls, and you have maize, and I want some maize, but you do not want ceramic bowls. Instead of having to trade around the market to to convert my bowls into something that you do want, I can sell my bowls for money and pay you for maize in money. As portable and storable commodity monies also reduce the costs of losing perishable goods and can bridge seasonal gaps in production as you convert what you can produce now into a storable currency that you can then use to purchase what you need at a later date. Old and New World evidence both make it clear that formal currencies are not necessary for market exchange in the ancient world, although they can certainly help. And I'm showing you a picture here of potatoes as one of my favorite examples. In the economic crisis in Bulgaria, people stopped using the formal currency and started using potatoes in a lovely paper titled, "You Can Buy Anything with Potatoes." The third category of costs that can make or break marketing decisions are opportunity costs. Any good foraging model weighs the benefit of your chosen activity against the benefit of participating in other activities, other options. The same thing can be said for producing for and participating in exchange. Households have to make time allocation decisions based on all of the things that they need to do and the gains to value from each. Increasing opportunity costs for participating in a market might happen on a seasonal basis, discouraging exchange during periods of peak demand on the household supply of agricultural labor. So the Zonde, for example, resisted colonial pressure to produce cotton for sale because it coincided with the planting season of a key subsistence crop. Conversely, seasonal downtime in agricultural cycles also creates opportunity for value-added craft production. Higher opportunity costs might characterize households with restricted labor availability, higher dependency ratios, or access to less productive or more demanding agricultural land. So we might see people fall in and out of market participation as the value or the need of other activities fluctuates up and down. In the model presented previously, if the value for household consumption is higher than the value for exchange, we expect people to produce for household consumption and not to produce for exchange in the marketplace. That would be considered a missing market as people choose not to participate in the market. I always feel that behavioral ecology models are guidelines for human behavior, but that there are important caveats that contribute to behavioral variation and how people actually make decisions based instead of just our general predictions from modeling behavioral decisions in an abstract context. And some important caveats here that I think are important to keep in mind are that exchange may be sought for risk reduction, achieved by averaging over regions asynchronously afflicted by resource shortfalls. Exchange might also be used to acquire commodities not available locally for their risk mitigating storage potential, perhaps in the form of pseudo or more formal currencies. So we imagine that people are trying to maximize gain in the model presented, but this might not always be the case. People may be instead desiring to minimize risk of shortfalls, and there's some evidence that for centuries, peasants like the ones pictured at the top in this picture from Russia around the turn of the 19th century um, resisted participating in markets because producing the sale of a cash crop was less reliable than producing for household consumption. Another thing to consider is that we have examined market decisions as a bottom-up decision in terms of how households are making decisions about whether or not they want to participate in the market. And although household processes are responsible, at least in part, for market formation in China, Nubei, Japan, Java, England, and Japan, as cited in Blanton and Farger in 2010, we also know that top-down forces and coercion can be incentive enough to participate in market exchange. If you're living in the Inca Empire and you have to pay taxes in bolts of cotton, and you live where cotton doesn't grow, then you have to produce something to exchange for cotton, and therefore you are participating in a market because of a top-down force. There's been a long-running debate about whether markets appear a result of top-down or bottom-up forces, and it can be useful to isolate our thinking on either end of the spectrum to explore research questions, but in reality, it will always be both. People participate to exchange in markets when markets exist, and markets function more smoothly when transaction costs are decreased by institutional factors that often come from top-down forces. Finally, let's not forget that markets are fun. Entertainment and opportunities to socialize presumably influence decisions to participate in markets. Congregation in large groups allows marketers to meet kin and friends, look for marriage partners, seek enhanced status, or to simply enjoy a break in household routine. And these types of motivations, and presumably others, like opportunities for thievery, are observable but difficult to quantify for inclusion in models. And as Herzkovits states for the Dahomey, yet more than an economic significance attaches to this institution, for the marketplace is also a center for social activities and a place where religious rites are held. So markets exist for many reasons, one of which is for economic gains from exchange. So, a household level bottom up approach using a behavioral ecology perspective seeks to develop theoretically consistent explanations for early market exchange behaviors. And we find that multiple factors, environmental heterogeneity and production possibilities, population density, efficient transport, social minimization of transaction costs, auspicious interhousehold opportunity costs, must all come together in the right manner to make market exchange attractive to households. Even very simple models point us towards multi-causality as the default perspective on this problem. And although we address origins in prehistory, elements of this analysis may also apply to missing market situations within what otherwise are contemporary commoditized price-setting markets. Food deserts, urban areas with few or difficult to access stores that stock fresh produce, are an excellent example of how travel distance and opportunity costs can affect market participation choices. Likewise, convenience stores take advantage of the cost-benefit calculations discussed here by increasing prices under the cover of the high costs imposed by travel to less expensive outlets. I always wanted to call this paper Getting Your Milk at the Corner Store. It's closer, and the milk is more expensive. We still daily make decisions about market participation, which were paramount in the prehistoric origins of market exchange by barter and trade. Thank you for listening. If you're interested, here are some excellent resources for further reading, and of course the original paper on which this talk is based by myself, Catherine Demps, and my wonderful co-author, Bruce Winterhalter. Thank you.